Hello, my name is Martinos, and I'm developing a Dark Souls and Dead Cells inspired top-down roguelike game where the player has to complete 3 objectives within the dungeon while being chased by the big bad boss, who will then become a final obstacle that the player has to defeat in an epic battle. It's crazy how slightly more than 7 months have already passed since I was laid off and decided to make my own game. I sometimes look back at all the changes I did and catch myself thinking, did all of this really take me this much time? But then I remember there was also quite a lot of learning, like drawing and making music. I've also spent time researching other various topics, and well, making devlogs and TikToks does consume quite a bit of time. In this period, the game also changed. For example, I completely eliminated the idea that everything is tied to a clock, and player has to choose if they want to gather items or challenge the boss while it is still weak. I mentioned my reasons and solutions in the previous video, but I didn't talk much about the inner worry that this resulted in. You see, since I am an overthinker, I constantly reconsidered this decision. The main thought that was plaguing me was, what if these are good ideas and I just lack the confidence in them, because they would really add to the uniqueness of my game. After quite a bit of contemplating, I decided that with the current combination of the seal room, the boss chasing the player and the glyphs, the game should feel novel enough and maintain an achievable scope. And if I get to make a sequel, well, then the time-sensitive aspect of the game should definitely be tried out and experimented with. There's a lot of advice saying that when making a game, first make a quick and dirty prototype, and when you feel like it plays nice, remake everything from scratch. This advice is quite sound, but it never made sense to me when working on this game. I knew I was making a roguelike, and I knew what the game I envision needs, so why waste time on making an inferior and less thought out version of the various systems that I know I'll definitely need? Nevertheless, I was still worried. Was I overlooking something? Is there something missing? Am I just being dumb? After all, I was ignoring a very big prototyping rule. However, when researching I found this very nice video, and one sentence calmed me down. Jonas was talking about exploring one's game ideas, and in a single phrase he validated my approach, when he talked about targeting a specific niche and how it's better to go straight to it and then start exploring later. Basically what I was doing by first making item, attribute and level generation systems and then experimenting with them to see what fun things I can make. And now I'm reaping the benefits, as making, using and experimenting with items is super easy. It's also quite easy to reuse the same items between the enemies and the player. Look at this combustion blood spell for example. For a price of one's health, it will create a magic circle that will explode after a short delay. I had to make it use different health cost values between the player and the enemies, since enemies' health is much cheaper than the players, but that was mostly it. Making glyphs was even easier. I think I created like 5 in combined time of a half of a day, and even then the most time I spent was on making the textures and adjusting the code to support more functionality, which nicely brings us to... Well, in short, the game is fully playable, with 8 ability items, 4 normal monsters, 1 type of seal room, a poison barrel, 6 glyphs and finished first boss battle with a small cutscene at the end. But there's more. Let's start with me buying Risk of Rain 2 when it was on sale. I've heard that a lot of game designers like it, so I decided to try it out myself, especially since it's a roguelike and I'm making one. And within the first minute, I had my biggest revelation. I mentioned this previously in one of my devlogs, but I really struggled with giving player a reason to fight enemies and not just skip past them, since the player can freely move between the rooms, a necessity as the floor boss follows the player around. My first idea was to put enemies at narrow corridors and other choke points, but the player can lure them out and just go on. My second idea was to have an invisible tracker that would count how many enemies have seen the player and haven't died yet. When the threshold is reached, the patrolling boss is notified and rushes to the player. But this solution became obsolete, as the boss is locked up until the player discovers the first seal, and it also always knows where the player is, just walks slowly. But a simple mechanic is what brought me the answer. If the player wants healing or ability items, they simply need to accumulate enough soul fragments, the game's currency, which they can get by defeating enemies, clearing seal rooms, or sometimes finding it on the ground, and then use it to open chests, which contains random loot. Though it's not like I didn't plan for chests and similar loot sources. I did, but what I originally had in my mind were chests that could be opened for free, or by the use of keys, similar to Binding of Isaac. What makes the pay-for-loot solution great in my eyes is that it unifies multiple systems like the ability items, the steel rooms, and the enemies in an easy to understand way, and that's why when I experienced it in Risk of Rain 2, it felt like a correct solution for my game. I make weekly short format updates on TikTok, YouTube and Instagram, and in one of the TikToks that I made some time ago, people said that the drop down menu that I created was trash, and I agree. So I changed that, and also added a pause menu to allow for switching items and checking what glyphs are currently equipped. Also, screens for dying and winning the game have been added as well. All that's left is an options menu, which is going to be my next objective. Now, in roguelike games, it is important to create variety between individual runs. The most obvious way to achieve it is by randomizing the whole dungeon and having a lot of different weapons and abilities, but some games push it a bit further by granting a random item, ability or a buff from the start. The best example would be Hades. The very first thing that the player sees when they enter the dungeon is a free gift from one of the guards, and I really like the freshness this gives, and I wanted something similar for my game. That's why I added a mercy chest. It is a completely free chest with random ability items or glyphs that the player can open only once in a run, and when I added it, I definitely felt the change during my playtests. While yes, there aren't that many items thus causing repetition, this issue will eventually solve itself when I add more content to the game. I've also added a compass that will point to the closest seal room, and after all of them are cleared, to the starting area, where the teleportation circle to the final challenge awaits for the player. I created it to give players some direction and a goal rather than leaving them stranded and clueless in what to do in this big dungeon. And a compass is perfect as it shows just the direction but doesn't tell which room to go to, as some paths could curve around or be a dead end, thus guiding the player while still not spoiling the fun of exploration. I've also achieved quite a big milestone. I finally have a built version of my game, which I sent out to some of my friends to get their first impressions, which leads us to the final part of the video. And before that, if you're enjoying, why not subscribing? More content will come. I've already received some feedback, which I noted and wrote down some possible solutions. I am planning to repeat this 2 more times, with each reaching friends that haven't played the game yet, which is important as it allows me to hear more opinions that are not influenced by their previous experiences with the game. I'm also planning to add a bit more content, like additional room type, which won't have any enemies, but instead various moving hazards, to give some fresh variety, some seal room variations, and finally a graphical improvement that will help with how the lights affect the sprites in the game world. If this sounds like a lot of work, it is. And I'm worried that everything is taking way longer than maybe it should, as first I was planning only a year of development and been pushing the finish deadline quarter by quarter. But I haven't released a game all by myself before, so it's hard to judge. Finally, after these changes, I would like to contact some publishers and see if I can get any kind of response. I understand that I will potentially lose my indie and solo dev titles, which is a great loss, but I also realize that I'm not as passionate about marketing and selling as much as I am about making the game itself. And since failing to sell the game will prevent me from continuing to do what I love, I would like to find someone with potentially vastly more experience to help me. Of course, I'm prepared to publish this game by myself and I have some ideas on how to do it, like public demos and early access. But since I mostly don't need any funding to release my game, I should be quite a safe investment, and that's why I want to try my luck. But that's a story for another devlog. I'm also planning to stream the development of my game on Twitch, so stay tuned for more information. I hope you enjoyed this devlog, and I hope you are as excited for this game as much as I am. See you next time. Bye bye.